No matter how small, every town has one. Maybe just the obelisk, a few names inlaid. More often, full-scale granite, marble digger, arms reversed, long descending lists of dead. Sometimes not even a town. A thickening of houses or a few unlikely trees glimpsed on a back road will have one. 1919, 1920, all over the country. Maybe a band, slow march, mayors, shire councils, relatives for whom print was already only print. Mates, come back, moving into unexpected days.
By the 1950s, a unique Australian society was firmly in place. 2 world wars were behind us, and we felt we'd earned our time in the sun. Since then, we've fought in 5 more conflicts, transformed our defence forces, and learned to become peacekeepers. The Anzac legend and 100 years of military history have helped to shape our nation and our people. Almost 2 million Australians have experienced military service. It's part of our national identity. Yet being in a war is an intensely personal matter, different for each individual. Far too often that experience has meant sacrifice. Australia's century of war has been at the cost of more than 100,000 lives. For some, the experience has never ended.
And to this day, there's not a day goes by that I don't think about Vietnam. It is so much a part of you that you can never, ever shake it. And I think the main reason for that is the way we were treated when we came home. We were second-class citizens, and we thought we'd done a great job. We were very proud of what we did. We did our best, and we came home to a pretty bad reception.
I put it out of my mind when I came back. Put the war right out of my mind. That's why I never joined the RSL or never took any part in anything like that. War celebrations or that, I avoided them.
If you've witnessed it and been there and done it, you remember it, but then you try not to remember it. And this is the whole thing. I have been trying not to remember, and I think we all do that.
Marvellous what a man can stand when he's got to. We've got a purpose driving him.
Over the centuries, it doesn't seem to me that war has ever achieved very much. No wars.
But as we celebrated our 100th birthday as a nation, among the crowds were many families who have not been affected by war. The Australians who gathered together in 1901 had already been engaged in 3 conflicts. The past, it is said, is another country. Back then, the taking up of arms was seen as the responsibility of voters and landowners. The price of having property and rights was being prepared to defend them. Today, we are not as comfortable with military matters. We prefer to have professional forces to fight on our behalf and in our interests. At the turn of the century, Empire interests and British heritage were thought of as identical to our own. Now that legacy must take its place among all the other nationalities that call themselves Australian. In 1901, they faced the beginning of a century. We face a millennium. At such times, people take stock and try to predict the future. Then as now, hope and trepidation were in the air. As 1900 approached, Australia was enduring one of the worst droughts since white settlement. The hard times strengthened many people's faith in the Australian character as a tough and independent bushman, conveniently ignoring the fact that most people lived in cities. We were reaching out to the rest of the world. In Paris, Freddie Lane was the first of our Olympic gold medal swimmers, and Nellie Melba sang her way to 23 curtain calls in Vienna. We saw ourselves as one of the youngest children of the empire, with common ties of race, language and culture. Many called themselves Australian Britons. In 1870, 2 years after the last convicts arrived, the British government withdrew its forces, but by then we were taking responsibility for our own defence. Each colony had units of civilians carrying rifles and wearing uniforms. They were competitive and keen to make their mark. When an Empire hero, General Charles Gordon, was speared to death by Islamic rebels in the Sudan in 1885, they grabbed their chance. The newly laid telegraph brought the news to Australia just 2 weeks later. Upstaging the other colonies, the Premier of New South Wales immediately offered an expeditionary force to avenge Gordon's death. Like many country towns, Bathurst rallied to the cause. Their volunteer rifle corps had been training for nearly 20 years. Now they could be put to the ultimate test of manhood. Picnics were held, concerts performed, and money raised. Finally, 19 sons of Bathurst in brand new uniforms caught the train to Sydney. 770 volunteers sailed from Circular Quay, and 2 out of every 3 Sydney-siders cheered them on their way. It didn't matter that we had no connection with the Sudan. Britain was there, and that was enough.
To arms, ye sons of Austral's land. Your queen has bid you fight. you go a well-chosen band to fight for Britain's right. Go then, brave boys, though you are far, far away, to fight for freedom's joys, for your country's sway. Then make the Saracen lie bleeding. Go then, brave boys, though you are far, far away. March on, all hearts resolved, on victory or death.
It wasn't quite victory or death. The Sudan fizzled out into what was described as a paltry affair. Between the farewell and the war lay the reality of distance. And by the time our first volunteer soldiers to fight overseas reached Africa, it was all but over. They fought in just one small skirmish in which 3 privates were slightly wounded. The rest of the time they built camps and guarded the railway. But they did encounter the man who was to have a long and controversial influence over Australia's fighting forces. Major General Lord Horatio Herbert Kitchener, hero of Khartoum, Gordon's holy avenger, and the most empire-minded of soldiers. As a war, the Sudan was a disappointment. But Australians had shown that they would rally to Britain's cause, whether they asked us to or not. Imperial feeling in Australia was almost a religion, and we were keen for another chance. The Empire provided it in South Africa. The Boers, like Australians, wanted freedom. The British wanted control. Fierce political resistance by the Boers turned into armed confrontation.
Well, we were fighting for possession of the things that they had. They had diamond mines and gold mines. And if it hadn't been for that, probably we wouldn't have been there.
England's forces on our frontiers were increasing, and we knew to what end. We had therefore as men no choice but to send out the challenge immediately, before the odds became impossible and before we were quite at bay. War was bound to come, for the Boer and the Briton despised each other and would never have been satisfied till the dispute had been settled by arms.
The British had enjoyed a century of military victories. Complacent and at first badly led, they were unprepared for the Boers' commando tactics. Within a month, the unthinkable had happened. 3 towns, Mafeking, Kimberley and Ladysmith, were all under siege. The Boer leader, Uncle Paul Kruger, had spat in the face of the Empire. Some Australians took it personally.
I'm coming, Paul Kruger, to have a talk with you. A word into your ear, old man. I am the kangaroo, the emu, and the possum, and the eucalyptus tree. In other words, Australia. And this I say to thee, now, Mr. Paul Kruger, just let my father be.
Others wanted nothing to do with any kind of militarism. 40 years before, aggressive police work by the British military saw 28 diggers killed while demanding their rights at the Eureka Stockade. And though the troops were supposed to protect the colonies from external attack, they fought alongside white settlers against Aborigines and Maoris to free land for farming. Some Australians were anti-military, others anti-empire. Why, they asked, should Australians be used by the British to shoot down Boer farmers who were also demanding their rights? Henry Lawson, a contributor to the Bulletin, reacted in a passionate and angry mood.
Some of us are willing, willfully, blindly eager, mad, to cross the sea and shoot men whom we never saw, and whose quarrel we do not and cannot understand. Our cry is for England, or blood is thicker than water, and so we seek to blind and deceive ourselves as fools, unanimous in their eagerness to sacrifice right, justice, truth, everything, to satisfy their selfish craving for what they consider a picnic, to have some fun, to have a spree.
But opposition remained ineffectual. The men wanted to go. The press was generally enthusiastic, and the British, criticised by other countries for their bullying tactics, were keen to have Australian support. Queensland jumped first. The young Captain Harry Chevelle assured potential recruits that the war would be a grand picnic with very little risk. In Toowoomba, Colonel Ricardo challenged the manhood of his recruits.
Those who are willing to go to the Transvaal stand on the right of Sergeant McClellan, and those who are going to stop and grow pumpkins stand in the ranks.
When the first New South Wales contingent marched to Circular Quay, 300,000 Sydney-siders braved the rain to cheer. Only a few lonely voices raised a protest. The men who boarded the ship began the experience of Australians at war. They had about them a distinct look and were tall, fit and strong. Mostly unmarried, they were generally aged in their mid-20s.
Long-legged fellows, brown and hard-faced, and all with the alert, wide-awake look that distinguishes the Australian soldier from the more stolid English Tommy.
If infantrymen, they probably came from the city. If mounted, then the country was most likely their home. Though they fancied an adventure, they had little military discipline and no knowledge of the art of war. But they were ready to prove themselves. When they arrived in South Africa, the landscape astonished them.
The country that I travelled or served over was mostly veldt, South African veldt. And that would be masses of plains, miles and miles of plain country, interspersed here and there by small mountains or hills called koppies.
It's no place for foot soldier. They'd have to be cavalry. They'd have to be mounted because it was all rough open country.
So they led us a pretty wild dance, you know. And they were fighting for survival. No spirit of adventure that prompted them into it. They're fighting for the survival.
On the first day of 1900, Trooper Victor Stanley Jones was shot dead in South Africa. Australia had its first sacrifice. The 27-year-old Queenslander was the first of the century's 100,000 war dead. He was in a 5-man patrol under Lieutenant Alfred Adie. Sent out to scout by their British commander, they rode to a small farm called Sunnyside. The enemy saw them first. Adie was thrown off his horse, hit by 2 bullets and badly wounded. Victor Jones died instantly, shot through the heart. With the curious premonition that comes to soldiers in war, Jones had spoken of his own death that morning.
As Victor was riding away, he seemed to me to be more reserved than usual. So I said, "Cheer up, Victor, you'll soon be dead." And instead of his usual reply, he said, "Yes, Ben, old pal, you're right this time." And I was never afterwards guilty of saying those words to a man. He cured me of that kind of horseplay.
It was their first combat, and despite the fact that they won, it was in truth a minor affair. At home, though, anxious for any proof that we were equal to the British, the newspapers played it up shamelessly.
The Queenslanders behaved magnificently, and while under fire, chatted and laughed with the utmost sang-froid.
The Boers, heavily outnumbered, avoided head-on battles. They would hit and run on battlefields that covered thousands of kilometres. They were commandos, well adapted to the country.
He was a wonderful shot and a wonderful horseman, but that was all we ever saw of him. You never seen nothing, no hand-to-hand fighting. They'd hide behind some rocks and fire at you, and then as soon as you get, they're off. And then you had to either chase them or stop where you was.
Only a fortnight after Sunnyside, our reputation was shaken in an afternoon of bloody chaos. Lieutenant Willoughby Dowling's patrol of 21 New South Wales troopers was heading back to camp when they were attacked. Dowling reacted like many of the new Australian officers, with confidence, daring, and inexperience.
Dowling turned his rifle on the attackers, but he was soon down with a bullet wound in the head. Then he was on his feet again, only to be felled by a shot which blew off his thumb. But he rose again, firing away with his revolver. 2 bullets in the legs dropped him by his dead horse, but it was a blow on the head with a rifle butt, which finally quietened the Mudgee lieutenant.
Dowling was captured along with 13 others. The next day, an anxious Australian search party followed the noise of vultures feeding on dead horses and found 1 dead and 1 dying Australian. There was an inquiry that found no one at fault, but the Australians were retired to a rest camp away from the action. British command felt that they were poor soldiers. The great adventure was turning a little sour.
The constant snap and sniping of the foe you never see makes you wonder, will your turn come? When and how? As the Mauser ball hums past you like a kind of vicious bee. Oh, we're going on a long job now.
Banjo Patterson was the war correspondent for the Sydney Morning Herald and the Melbourne Argus. He was 35 and at the height of his popularity. He relished his characters, the bushman soldiers.
The English troops, as a rule, have a heavy, vacant, chore bacon look about them, while our compatriots, on the other hand, looked smart enough to steal a policeman's watch if they were given half a chance.
But by the time he left a year later, he saw no honour or glory in chasing a few Boers from hill to hill. He was disillusioned and weary of the war.
When the dash and the excitement and the novelty are dead, and you've seen a load of wounded once or twice, or you've watched your old mate dying with the vultures overhead, will you wonder if the war is worth the price?
The man who gloried in the British race now yearned for an independent Australia.
We will carry our own flag up to the front when we go to the wars again.
Patterson hated the devastation of his much-loved horses as they died in their thousands on the veldt. None of the 40,000 Australian horses returned home. During the war, 500,000 horses and mules were shot, blown to pieces in battle, or simply worked to death.
You went to sleep in the saddle. The horse would be taking you along and you're fast asleep. You'd go night and day, and you'd only stop and dismount when you was told to.
The war entered its first year, but Australia had problems of its own. A bubonic plague spread by rats. In the bush, the drought had reached disaster levels. Australia, harsh and unforgiving, forced its people to rely on each other for survival. When Australian medical teams went to South Africa, the compassion they had learned in hard times was not left behind. They were valued above all others, and they were badly needed, for this was a war where sickness was as lethal as bullets. Disease killed half the Australians who died during the war.
Not allowed to drink the water in case it was poisoned. Not allowed to drink the water until it had been analysed by a doctor. And if the doctor said it was all right, we'd drink it. If it wasn't, we had to either go without or drink this slime out of the ponds. And that was really the worst experience.
Albert, Harry, Herbert and Walter Tame were brothers from Wingello in New South Wales who went to war together. Only Albert returned. Typhoid took the others.
Funerals, alas. As many as 20 a day have passed this place, which is near the cemetery, and always 7 or 8 in the afternoon. And as I write, they're sounding the last post on the bugle at another funeral.
One Australian nurse watched helplessly as 5 of her charges died, one after the other.
One was terrible. Quite mad, but often so touchingly gentle and so grateful. "Ah," he used to say, "that's splendid," as I was bandaging his poor face. And the night before he died, he asked me to kiss him.
The New South Wales Army Medical Corps commandeered this building and set up their hospital. They took in everyone, Australian, British or Boer. Fittingly, it was a doctor who was awarded Australia's first Victoria Cross. Captain Neville House from Orange in New South Wales rode to rescue a trumpeter brought down by enemy fire. Though his horse was shot from under him, he continued on foot, treating the man under fire, then carrying him to safety. We were awarded 6 Victoria Crosses in South Africa, not for killing the enemy, but for saving others. Australians could ride, shoot and live off the land as well as the Boers. Finding them, though, was another matter. Then, in an unlikely place called Aylands River, they found the challenge they'd sought. "500 men were garrisoned at Aylands River, including 350 Australian bushmen. The Boers wanted the plentiful supplies in the camp and attacked. During the night, around 2,000 Boers wheeled their guns into place.
Shelling started in the grey light of morning. was a perfect hail of bullets and shells, north, south, east, west. They came in simultaneously. We were and are completely surrounded. The big guns are completely out of our range. We have only a 7-pounder, which is completely useless.
One man was lying with his arm blown away, and a great hole in his side, such as is made in the earth by a shovel. As I lay by his side, the shells flying over us, he rocked from side to side in agony.
1,000 shells were fired down on them. Trooper Wardell was the first man killed. His mates carved his name on a piece of slate, making it his gravestone. That first night the shelling eased, and men dug literally for their lives. Bayonets hacked into the ground, and digging tools were so scarce that the price of a pick was £3 for half an hour. For 5 days they were pinned down. Then the Boer commander called for their surrender. The story goes that the Australians' commander was given no choice in his reply.
Even if I wished to surrender, and I don't, I am commanding Australians who would cut my throat if I accepted your terms. I don't expect your artillery will change the minds of these men.
Though given up for dead, the Australians defied the Boers for 2 weeks, patrolling at night, killing silently. It was the stuff of legend. If Banjo Patterson had been at Aylands River, its name might have been as familiar to us as Gallipoli.
They were the only troops who could scout into our lines at night and kill our sentries while capturing and killing our scouts. Our men openly admitted that the Australians were more formidable opponents and far more dangerous than any British troops.
After 10 days, the British realised they were still holding out. Kitchener led 20,000 men on a forced march to relieve them.
Oh, it was a grand sight to see the columns coming in. As far as we could see through the glasses, the column extends. Lord Kitchener congratulated us on the stand we made. It was reported we had surrendered.
"80 men, 1 in 5 of the defenders were casualties.
When the ballad makers of Australia seek for a subject, let them turn to Eland's River, for there was no finer fighting in the war.
The British told them they would receive official recognition for their bravery. Nothing eventuated, and many Australians believed it would have been different if they'd been British.
And who were the moving spirits in this glorious addition to the list of the stories of British arms? A few score colonial youths, mostly Queenslanders, with no military training to speak of. You may not see much of this magnificent defence in the official reports, but let me say that very great jealousies of colonial troops are noticeable here.
Australians were dying in South Africa. Yet when the Empire called for help in another nationalist uprising, the Boxer Rebellion in China, away we went again. The entire navy of South Australia, the cruiser Protector, sailed to China. The senior British naval officer was delighted to see them.
I have never seen a finer body of men, clean and smart-looking. Our country is fortunate to have so many staid and disciplined men willing to volunteer for active service. Remember, you're doing good work for Queen and country. They call you the Australian contingent. A very good name. But remember, we regard you as the British contingent from Australia.
The men cheered his words, but again we arrived late. The 55-day siege of Peking was over, and they could do little except to help clean up the mess and loot vigorously. 6 Australians died, all from illness. In South Africa, the Boers had adopted guerrilla tactics, and Kitchener tightened the screws. He denied the Boers any civilian support by what we would later call a scorched earth policy. Boer farms were systematically attacked, looted and burned. Women and children were taken to concentration camps, so called because they concentrated the civilians together. Some Australians were uncomfortable with their new duties.
We cleared the country by burning all farmhouses, and the poultry fell to the victors.
Chasing the farmers out of their cottages and their families and burning them down. That's what we didn't like. We had to do that because they would get behind us and shoot us from the back.
There was no honour or romance in harassing women and children, even less in herding them behind wire fences. Conditions in the camps were appalling. Emily Hobhouse, an English morals campaigner, reported her outrage in British and Australian newspapers.
In many instances, I was an eyewitness of what took place. I saw families huddled up close to the railway lines. I saw crowds of them along the railway lines in bitterly cold weather, in pouring rain, hungry, sick, dying and dead. I never had any doubt that every female countryman of mine would have felt just as I did at the sight of all this, with a profound feeling of compassion, burning with the desire to alleviate the suffering.
Kitchener was unapologetic.
Extermination is a long and very tiring business. They seem as fanatically disposed to continue this war as ever, and I fear it can only end by our catching all, or almost all of them. It's very hard work for our men. I try all I can, but it's not like the Sudan, and disappointments are frequent.
The concentration camps did not have the horrific intent adopted later by Hitler. But through neglect and poor planning, 40,000 men, women and children would die in them by the end of the war. Little of this was reported at home. The war had become tiresome and slow, and Australians were preoccupied with federation, the joining of the 6 colonies into the Commonwealth of Australia. Australians had long wanted to be one people, without mixing with other races. They saw their northern neighbours as an economic and cultural threat. Unity was critical. So on a sultry Sydney morning in January 1901, Federated Australia was born. Immigration restrictions were rushed into legislation, and our first National Defence Force was born. The 4,000 men of the Australian Commonwealth Horse sailed for South Africa in 1902. The war was over before half of them arrived. But they were our first national force, wearing uniforms with the letters AC on the shoulder straps, upturned slouch hats, and for the first time, the Rising Sun badge. A tradition had begun. Before the new federal force could even try on their uniforms, other Australians in South Africa were being cursed as cowards. On a cold winter's night in June 1901, 350 recently arrived and untrained Victorians were camped in a farmyard at Wilmansrust, settling down to sleep. 140 Boer commandos slipped past their sentries and, running forward, fired from the hip at point-blank range into the men lying round their campfires.
I fired so quickly that I hardly kept count of the cartridges in the magazine. But I knew that when the gun said click, it was empty. I forced in another 5 cartridges, and then another 5 in the same way, all of which I emptied into a wall of shouting and excited human forms, weirdly lit up by the campfires.
The Australians panicked and 18 men were killed, more than in any other single action in the war. A court of inquiry censured the British officer in charge, but it savaged the Victorians.
In considering the chicken-hearted behaviour of the officers and men of the Victorian Mounted Rifles, we must remember that they were recruits and that their behaviour was only what was to be expected in the circumstances.
Their commander, the British Major General Beatson, did not hold back either.
I tell you what I think. The Australians are a damn fat, round-shouldered, useless crowd of wasters. In my opinion, they're a lot of white-livered curs. You can add dogs, too.
Stung, a Victorian trooper, James Steele, spoke out against Beatson.
It'd be better to be shot than go out with a man who calls you white-livered curs.
He was court-martialed along with 2 others for incitement to mutiny and sentenced to death by firing squad. Kitchener commuted the sentences to imprisonment. In Australia, the press berated the men for their humiliating defeat and mutiny. But there was also unease that Australians under British command could be sentenced to death without the knowledge or approval of the new federal government. More embarrassment was to follow. The war was in an even more erratic phase. The British controlled the Bushveld Carbineers, a mostly Australian unit designed to act independently and irregularly against the Boers. One of these patrols was led by Lieutenant Harry Morant, called the Breaker, because of his horse-riding skills. Over the years, Morant would be transformed into an Australian legend. But in a Grubby incident, Morant and Lieutenant Peter Hancock were accused by their British masters of murdering Boer prisoners. They were court-martialed and convicted. Their defence was that they were acting under orders.
Could have had the decency to measure us first.
Don't suppose they've had many complaints.
I'm going to find out the grand secret. I will face my God with the firm belief I obeyed my orders and served my king as I thought best. If I overstep my duty, I can only ask my people and country for forgiveness.
Despite appeals for mercy, Kitchener ordered their execution.
Shoot straight, you bastards! Don't make a mess of it!
The British did not consider it necessary to inform the Australian government of the deaths. The Australian press disowned the men, and the public appeared to be ashamed of them. Morant and Hancock were buried on top of each other in a simple grave at Pretoria, near their execution site. Only one of the Australian war dead was returned home. Their bodies buried on the veldt or interred in nearby cemeteries. often sharing the consecrated ground with their Boer enemy. After 31 months, peace was finally negotiated in May 1902. Despite a few failures, Australians were now accepted and admired by others in the Empire. They'd shown courage, endurance, independence and initiative, all the promise of exceptional soldiers.
If there had been a few more Australians, the war would have ended much quicker. They were the only type of men that were capable of checkmating the tactics of the Boers.
Many who returned were disappointed that the jobs they expected for their efforts did not happen. But monuments did, erected by the public all over the country. We were now called a nation, but we fought in South Africa for the Empire, and most of the monuments reflected this belief. We thought of ourselves as Anglo-Australians. Australians believed they had an absolute right to protect themselves against Asian invasion. Previously, we depended on imperial might, especially the Royal Navy, to keep us safe from harm. Now the argument turned towards self-defence. In 1903, Parliament debated and passed the Defence Act that laid down two lasting principles. In peacetime, our military would consist mostly of civilian soldiers, and in time of war, no man could be compelled to fight overseas. But we had no national anthem and no national flag. The colonies had not formed a nation, they'd simply united. In defence, Australia needed powerful friends. Prime Minister Alfred Deakin invited the United States government to send their Great White Fleet to visit us. The news was greeted with headlines and cheers. On a spring morning, 16 ships of the American Navy steamed into Sydney Harbour. The city went wild.
There's a grand and noble fleet that we're called upon to greet and welcoming to Australia's sunny shore. From the mighty USA, they are sailing on their way. A hearty cheer awaits them, I am sure. When they reach our sunny land, we'll extend a friendly hand and treat them all as brothers, taunt and true. For when all is said and done, as a race, we all are one. All descended from the old red, white and blue.
Australia became the first self-governing country in the Empire to buy and own a navy. We instituted a naval college and financed and eventually crewed all our ships. A citizens' army was planned, but there was argument about how to achieve it. Deakin wanted a volunteer force, a defence of the people, by the people, for the people. But Billy Hughes, the ambitious Labour politician, believed all able-bodied men should be trained, whether they liked it or not. He wanted a rifle-wielding electorate capable of war. Encourage shooting, he said, till it becomes the national sport. Hughes won. Eventually, if you were male and aged between 12 and 26 in Australia, you were compelled to undergo military training. Thousands defaulted. But the system was largely successful and the size of the militia increased by 50%. Keen to have the British seal of approval on compulsory military training, the government invited that old friend of Australian soldiers, Viscount Kitchener, to visit us and prepare a report. It started badly. In Brisbane on his first inspection, only 250 cadets turned up for parade. And a column of tired troops marching past him barely managed to raise a salute to the great man. During his 7 weeks in Australia, Kitchener travelled inland only once, to Bathurst. He was to unveil the Boer War Memorial, finally completed 9 years after the war. The hero of the Empire was coming, and Bathurst was enthralled. The names of the local men were all there, all except Lieutenant Peter Hancock. It was Kitchener who had upheld his death sentence. Peter Hancock was living and working in Bathurst when he enlisted for the Boer War.
I'm not much of a letter writer, you know. If you ever heard from me, it'd probably be bad news.
His widow, Bridget, had only learned of his execution from a newspaper article. Still angry, she threatened to bring her 3 children and disrupt the unveiling. At the last minute, she was talked out of the inevitable embarrassment. Today, Hancock's name appears on the memorial as an add-on, the result of over 50 years of lobbying by his son and other family. Recently, another plaque was added, anonymously in the night, below Hancock's name. Its 3 words indicate deep feeling still, 100 years later. Kitchener's main legacy was to recommend the establishment of the Royal Military College, Duntroon, to train young officers. He also suggested charging students a fee of £80, but the Labour government refused to allow elitism in the army. In the first class to graduate, the principal cadet was the son of a carpenter. Across the Molonglo River on a clear autumn day in 1913, Australia's new capital was announced. Lord Denman, the Governor-General, laid the foundation stone, and Lady Denman declared the name to be Canberra. The band played God Save the King, guns were fired, and Prime Minister Fisher called for 3 cheers for Australia. As the shouts echoed across the limestone plains, no one there could have foreseen how soon the troops marching past would be hurled into battle. Nor could they ever have imagined that close by where they now stood, a massive memorial would be constructed. A memorial to commemorate the sacrifice in a war that was about to engulf them and their country.